Der Dialog beginnt jetzt allerdings mit dem ersten Redner und der ersten Perspektive, die ich einführen darf. Mein Name ist Anja Mittelberg-Farwig, Freie Universität Berlin, Seminar für katholische Theologie. Und ich wechsle jetzt die Sprache, da wir einen Gast unter uns haben, der es vorzieht, in Englisch zu sprechen, wenngleich ich glaube, dass er auch einiges Deutsch versteht. Und deswegen also nun ein Wechsel. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends in dialogue. I'd like to welcome all of you on behalf of the board of our conference, and it's most encouraging to see such a large audience here today and also many, many new faces also, if I may add this. And it's a clear sign that there is an intense interest in discussing all the urgent questions of poverty and justice. It is my pleasure and my privilege to introduce our first main speaker to you, Farid Ezak. We already heard a little bit about him and his theology while Muna was talking to us. I suppose you have undertaken a long journey to be here this afternoon, even longer than you, Mr. Staatssekretär. So I thank also you very much for coming and contributing here to our dialogue here in Germany. Introducing an internationally known person is not easy at all, as many of us know well all your publications or even are companions for a long time. Nevertheless, I would like to regard some stations of your biography and some of your main theological ideas, not only to approximate them, but also to draw nearer the topics we will be dealing with the next 2 days. Some main facts about Farid Ezak can be summarized in a few sentences. He's a prominent South African Muslim scholar. He's a social activist, political activist, a worker for interreligious dialogue. Currently, he is a professor of Islamic studies at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa, where he is also the head of the Department of Religion Studies. Before that, he has taught at many, many universities all around the world, especially in the United States and Europe. Let me mention just two of them, the University of Hamburg and Harvard University. But arriving in the academic world and reaching it to play such an important political role as a human rights activist was certainly a long way for Ezak and could not at all taken for granted when we look at his childhood and youth. However, without considering the biographical background and the experiences Ezak made, especially in his early years, his work cannot be understood. In most of his publications and interviews, Ezak argues with strong reference to what he had experienced and refers to his biography and his political context in detail. So he was born in South Africa in the year 1959. He grew up in Bontehovel, a colored township on the Cape Flats, together with 6 brothers and without an elder sister, which he had. And with his mother, who worked in a factory, underpaid and abandoned from her husband. Ezak writes, I quote, "My early life as a victim of apartheid and poverty, seeing my mother succumb under the burden of economic exploitation and patriarchy, filled me with an abiding commitment to a comprehensive sense of justice." The influence of his origin on his work is not limited, of course, to his family background, but can also be seen in the multi-religious neighborhood, for instance, where he experienced first religious otherness as valuable. The mosque of his township was an important place for him in his youth, and he was still at school and 9 years old when he was first arrested by the security police. Sentence missing here, sorry. 9 years old, he joined the Tablighi Jama, known as a conservative international revivalist movement. When he was first detained by When he was first detained by the security police for his work in the National Youth Action and the South African Black Scholars Association, he was still at school. As he was not allowed to study in South Africa, as he was regarded as colored, he accepted to go to Karachi, Pakistan, where he graduated with excellence in Islamic law and theology. Still in Karachi, he did postgraduate research in Quranic studies at Jamia Abu Bakr, but then finished his membership at Tabligh Jamaat and chose another way. He reached his doctoral degree in Birmingham, UK, the university there, and in the 90s, in 94 to 95, he was also research fellow in biblical hermeneutics, so he also did biblical studies at the Philosophisch-Theologische Hochschule St. Georgen here in Germany, in Frankfurt. Frankfurt am Main, one has to say. In the list of his publications, you will find many studies on the Quran, and which he underlines its contextuality. Isaac stresses here that the Quran has to be read in its context and has to take into consideration the present conditions of life that form the reader's perspective, or as he put it, interpreters are people. There is no text without context, and also the Quran is not an island unto itself. In 84 to 89, he was the national coordinator of the movement The Call of Islam. With others, he founded the Call of Islam, a branch of the United Democratic Front, which was a multi-religious movement against apartheid. The Call of Islam soon became the most active Muslim liberation movement. As a person committed to interreligious solidarity for justice and peace and the struggle against apartheid, he played a leading role not only here, but also in other organizations. He later served as a commissioner for gender equality in South Africa during the government of Nelson Mandela, and he considers himself as a Muslim feminist, as absolute equality of all human beings can certainly not be reached without gender equality. Until today, Isaac stands up against all forms of discrimination and global imperialism. In his theology, which is called an Islamic liberation theology, all this can be found as the revolt against injustice, the identification with the marginalized, and a liberative practice play the central role also here. Isaac teaches us to be suspicious of dominant paradigms. I should finally mention at least a few of Isaac's publications. I brought one of his books with me. You might know already, Quran, Liberation and Pluralism in Islamic Perspective, of interreligious solidarity against oppression, so you know what it is about. And one of his younger publications, I'd like to mention a book from 2009. He co-edited Islam and AIDS, Between Scorn, Pity and Justice, and perhaps a book which is a Quran introduction, or the famous book On Being a Muslim, Finding a Religious Path in the World Today. All this might give you a little picture. At least I tried my very best to talk about you and not about someone else, as you asked me to do. Well, today he will give us a lecture on speaking about the Quran, justice and compassion with your back against the wall. So we are very much looking forward to listen to you now, so if I may ask you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was one of the long introductions that I heard about myself. Oh no, I'm not complaining. I'm not complaining. And in listening to it, actually, there was a major element of sadness. I don't think that children should be growing up fighting for justice. I think the world that we are trying to create is a world wherein children should be allowed to be children. I think it's really sad that in so many parts of the world, children are, it's now romantic, but like myself, scrounging around for food on rubbish dumps, going to knock on the doors of white people asking for a piece of bread. So I think there's like something quite sad about the life of this character. But, you know, there's a Sufi saying, I kept complaining that I had no shoes until I met a man with no feet. So one day I was telling a colleague of mine in Massachusetts, in Cambridge, that I don't know what made us, because we weren't really close friends. So, oh, by the way, only the first part of my introductory talk is interesting. The rest of the stuff gets rather boring, so do enjoy these kind of random comments, okay? So I don't know what made me, he wasn't a close friend, I don't know what made me kind of get into a fairly intimate conversation. So I was telling about my sad life, okay, but it's not entirely without its redeeming features. So I told him, you know, my father left our family when I was 3 weeks old. So he said, oh gosh, I wish mine had done that. So then I realized, oh gosh, you know, there are some silver linings to this dark cloud. Okay, so those are just the two kind of comments about your these things. Three other little opening comments. The first is, it is true that for much of my life I have tried to figure out the implications of sometimes what I called a theology of not so much the marginalized, but the less marginalized. Very often we construct ideas that we say it is about equality, it is about justice, but the reality is that it is about our own rights. And so Muslims in Germany, for example, and I'm talking about many or most, the majority, for example, would clamor for their own rights in this society. Women would clamor for their own rights in relation to men. But the fact that Muslims are demanding their own rights in a society like this gives you no indication that they're actually committed to justice. It only gives you an idea that they're committed to their rights, which is fine, When women stand up and defend their rights, this doesn't give you an indication that they are committed to human rights. It only means that they are committed to their own rights. I mean, the fact that very many of us, once we arrive, we have arrived, and we don't care on whose backs we have arrived. And the other reality is that, that very often, even as we are walking towards our freedom, we're more than happy to walk over other people. For example, if you look at all the critique that Muslims have of the dominant Western societies wherein they live in the paradigm of we are being marginalized and we are oppressed, and I agree with much of this, okay? I agree with much of this. But all of their complaints are really mirrored in how we treat women inside our own society. The back of the bus, the silencing, or the back of the mosque. The back of the mosque, or downstairs, or at the back there, or to be voiceless, or we love to see these Muslims in little, you know, the little kind of these things, but, you know, they must know their place. So, you know, women as ornaments, but them. So much of the discourse or the lamentation that we have against against hegemony and power. In our own lives, we play this out. You even see this in say, so-called much more progressive content. Let me take the controversial one of gay rights. And so amongst gay activists, for example, you'll often find a marginalization of effeminate gay men. And then it's the gay thing, but the gay thing, it's largely a gay men thing. And the women are then, and so there are these different hierarchies. So I do want to say that in talking and critiquing other societies, very often it's not so much a principled commitment to justice that we have, but it's much more a reflection of our own determination to stand up for our own rights. That is valuable in itself. But certainly from an Islamic perspective, the ethical criteria is whether you are willing to stand up for the rights of others. How often, for example, do we reflect on the Christians in a country like Pakistan? I mean, now for the Yazidis, the fate of the Yazidis and the fate of the Christians in Iraq and in Syria, that has become big things. But that's in part because ISIS is part of a larger contestation and so on that involves seemingly this titanic war between Islam and the West. And now we know about the marginalization of Christians, or the oppression or the persecution of Christians in a particular part of the world. But the ongoing and systematic persecution, suffering, humiliation endured by Christians in a country like Pakistan. I'm speaking about this. It's a country wherein I lived for 8 years, and it's a country that's particularly still very close to my mind. These are off-the-cuff comments, people. Two other comments by way of introduction. You know, in this whole question, in this whole quest of reaching an understanding with Muslims and getting closer to Muslims and harmonization or recognition of diversity and so on, underneath all of this, there is still the assumption that, that Muslims must learn from us. To put it crudely, very many of the programs directed at the integration of Muslims are part of a larger project concerning the civilization of this, or the civilizing of this barbarian. I'm meant to be talking about socioeconomic justice in the early Meccan surahs and the difficulty of talking about this. The early Meccan surahs in the Quran, for those who know anything about the Quran, largely the Quranic things is divided into two parts. Some of the revelations are seen to be Meccan, and some of the other revelations are seen to be Madinan. The Prophet spent 13 years of his life as a prophet in Mecca and 10 years in Medina. The Meccan surahs generally focus seemingly just on belief, on dogma, on life in the year after, on issues like prophethood and accountability to God. And the Madinan surahs deal much more with social issues, with worship, with rituals and law. I want to look at the seemingly theological question of faith in the year after. This, and then the seemingly social and this worldly ad-dunya. And I will argue that the early revelations speak to societies where situations of poverty are both created and addressed by the administrative and organizational systems to enjoin upon one another compassion, وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْمَرْحَمَةِ, to enjoy one another with compassion. And that these actually go along with a critique of these systems, that the idea is that human society must move towards a more just system. The fundamental themes in the early Meccan surahs have an important relation to the clearly expressed moral obligations to care for the poor and to work for justice. To care for the poor and to work for justice. Religious people in general are very good at caring for the poor. We're not so good at working for justice. When, for example, you look at religious responses to HIV on a continent like Africa, you see that in general, religious communities have made by far the most significant contribution to the caring of people living with HIV. If you look at religious critiques of the systemic socio-economic systems that contribute to the spread of HIV and the particular vulnerability of HIV amongst women, then you see religions completely absent. We have nothing to say about the fact, we have a lot to say about why people become sick. In the words of Thomas Becker in the 16th century, when a bubonic plague hit Europe, cease vexing heaven and cease to die. Stop your fornication, stop your evil and promiscuous life, and God will stop punishing you. Or in the words of Malik Badri, a Sudanese psychologist, not a great advertisement for the psychology profession, that HIV is actually an angelic virus. It's an angelic virus in the same way that God sent angels before to destroy people. God sent the HIV virus to destroy sinful people. And so often we are very quick to care. When an accident happens, we can go and care, and we set up our charitable institutions. But we've got no questions to ask about why do accidents happen in that particular place all the time? Why, when poor people get hit by cars, they don't have access to health care? Ambulances never arrive. You remember, once I was in Indonesia when a dreadful earthquake struck in Yogyakarta, and our hotel collapsed. And I was standing on the street with my shorts on, and I had my passport in my bag. It was in the middle of the night, by the way. That's why I had shorts on, just in case there are some Muslims who think, oh, why does this guy wear shorts? I was sleeping in a shorts, okay? So yeah, I was standing on the street, and I felt fine. I've got a foreign passport in my pocket, and I've got credit cards in my pocket. And so you say, I'm going slightly off the point, by the way. You talk about, this act of God, and an earthquake strikes 6 points on the Richter scale in a place like Indonesia. Thousands of people get killed. An earthquake strikes on a much intenser level, 6.5 on the Richter scale, in a place like Tokyo, and nobody gets killed. It's a question of buildings and infrastructure. But generally, religions do a good job of looking at the consequences of these quote-unquote disasters without raising any questions about the socio-economic connections of all of this. And this is, by the way, why I was talking, I diverted when I started talking about the Quranic concern for the poor as well as to work for justice. Revealed in around about 610, the early Meccan surahs are short. They are replete with poetic phrasing and imagery. They present an image of a society that has grown arrogant and has forgotten how completely dependent it is upon God. Through epileptic visions, stories of God's intervention in history, promises of reward or punishment, and direct moral instruction, they express a call to the Arab society in which it was revealed: abandon your delusions of self-sufficiency and submit to God. But the idea of abandon this and do this. The idea of if you do this, then this is going to happen to you. The very idea of ma'ruf and munkar, good and bad, hasanat and sayyi'at, good and evil. The idea of a prophet arising and being told, قُمْ فَأَنذِرْ وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ, stand up and warn your people. So the idea of a prophet as a warner, it's intrinsic to the Quran. And it's very uncomfortable for us who often, I deal with this question at length in my Quran, Liberation and Pluralism. How do we affirm the idea of plurality and at the same time insist that there are non-negotiable norms and calls? And one of these non-negotiables is a call to create a more just society. And so with remarkable frequency and consistency, the early Meccan surahs make references to practices and attitudes of socio-economic significance. Even when money and its social functions are not explicitly mentioned, the themes repeatedly emphasized in the early revelations, they highlight the importance of the reform of socio-economic norms and behaviors. I really must skip some of these sections. It's just, I don't know if any, some of you are probably teachers, lecturers, professors. I don't know why. We never learn. We always run out of time. We are told, mercifully, by the way, the good news is that on the program I have 2 hours. No, I will not inflict this on any of you. But, we never learn. We are told you've got 20, well, I don't know, the Germanic conscience may be, but in the world wherein I operate, you are told you have 20 minutes and you still run out of time. And you've been a speaker for 50 years, you've been doing public speaking, and you still don't learn, Farid. You still prepare so... the human being in the Quran. The human being in the Quran is represented as a creation. A creation accountable to God. In the very first, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. Read in the name of your sustainer who created you. And so, we, human beings, but the major crime that human beings commit is the idea that we can become self-subsistent, that we can create our existences without others, and that we can create our existence without the sustainer. So we can't claim our own life as our exclusive domain. Without God, we would never have come into existence. This surah, the first surah in the Quran, continues its description by pointing out that human beings are remarkably prone to sin. Kalla innal insana la yatagha. Indeed, the human being is tyrannical. And so the first description indicates that we are inclined, perhaps inevitably, to moral transgression. But he believes himself to be self-sufficient. Ar-ra'a hustaghna. And this is the first sin, according to the Quran, that human beings create. And later, if I get the time, I'll try to explain how this became particularly characteristics of the leadership of Meccan society as they moved into, in their relations with the poorer sections of their society. I'll skip the context of which of how these the early Meccan surahs. But so, as for the God that we are worshipping, this God is a sustainer. He is all powerful. But above all, this God is Akbar. This God is greater than. Now, very often, this is translated as the greatest. This is not the literal translation of this. God is Akbar. God is the eternally transcendent. If you want to have in your dogmatics or your conception or your aqidah that God is like this or God is like this, or if you want to put him in a little box that you want to mark Islam, or you want to put him in a little box that you want to mark Catholicism, God is Akbar. God will escape from this box. God is bigger than this box. So God is the eternally transcendent, who is the creator of all humankind. But God is also now in the, I'm thinking about Naveed Kermani's Gott ist schön, God is beautiful. In the dominant liberal context today, there is enormous pressures on Muslims to only put what the dominant powers in the world consider the nice side of Islam. So tell us only about the beauty of God. Tell us only about the peaceful nature of Islam. And if you're going to talk about the jihad part of Islam, can you please only talk about the jihad, the Akbar part, the big jihad, the jihad against yourself? Can you please not speak about the jihad that means that's the real McCoy, you know, with real guns and weapons and so on and so forth. So we're living in a time where it is nearly impossible for an academic to present a truthful depiction of Islam. The only truthful depiction of Islam that Muslims are allowed to present to the world is a picture that the world is comfortable with. And the world is not really the world. The world is what is known as the international community. And the international community is not really the international community. The international community is really the North. That is simply how power works in the world today. And so it's very difficult to do, for example, an honest and a frank critique of violence in the Quran. Because you simply have to, for your audiences. I found myself on radio the other day speaking about ISIS. And I was quite shocked at myself. I couldn't possibly talk, you know, in a nuanced way about the Quran and violence. I had to talk in the context of huge ignorance where you have this white sheet. And if I make a couple of black dots on this sheet, the only thing that the audience will be focused on are these black dots. And if I ask you, what do you see? Nobody will say, I see a white sheet in front of me. And so I am forced by the nature of my audience to look at these black dots, that as a scholar, I may see smaller black dots, I may see more grayness and so on in this whole violence thing. I may see grayness, I may see a mixed legacy, theological legacy in the text and so on. But as a public intellectual, and the audience is now obsessed with all of these black dots, I have to spend all my time telling them, no, it's not really black dots that you are seeing. It's not really black dots you're seeing. They're not Muslims, these ISIS people. They're not a part of Islam. Islam says nothing about this. Islam says nothing about this. Whereas as a scholar, I know that there's far more grayness to all of this, but I'm not allowed to talk to my audience about the grayness because my audience is so obsessed with the black dots that they see. And so instead, I'm now forced to tell my audience, no, there are no black dots. You're not seeing any black dots. It's entirely white. But it also shows the larger part of the problem, how by the very nature of media, to sell a newspaper, every day you cannot tell people about this white sheet. People aren't interested in the white sheet. And so the ordinary life of the believer in his or her quest to come closer to God, that's the ordinary believer the life of the ordinary believer in the vast majority of Muslim countries and wherever Muslims live, struggling to make a living and struggling to get closer to God. We're not interested in that. We're interested in those black dots. To come back to people, I deliberately go into these diversions sometimes because if I just stick to reading my text, you would all have been asleep by now. So God acts, and God punishes. And this is the unpleasant part of it. And the act of inflicting punishment is mentioned in a number of occasions in the Quran. Not to be confused with the visions of the day of reckoning, when punishment will be meted out. There are stories of past events of divine punishment which have occurred within the bounds of ordinary history. There is Surah Al-Fil, where God dealt with the enemy of the elephant, the armies of Muslims who were vanquished en route to Mecca. Surah Shams includes another punishment story. This one is a bit richer for its inclusion of God's reasoning for inflicting punishment of a people. The tribe of Thamud, the destruction of their great city, the people of Ad. And all of this, of course, crimes of these communities are listed and so on in the Quran. One of the intriguing things that I've never really paid any serious attention to, although I find quite troubling, is the question of collateral damage. What happened to the innocents inside, when God comes and destroys a people? What happened to... Well, I don't know. I was about, often in the question of HIV and AIDS also. I mean, you have the phenomenon of, say, a muhajaba. I'm writing a book at the moment, by the way, with a colleague of mine on two Muslim women, one in Philadelphia and one in the United States, who are living with HIV and their struggles. But you have this phenomenon of the innocent victim. So you've got this muhajaba. This muhajaba who is HIV positive. Or in South Africa, there was a young hero, Thomas Nkosi, who was 11 years old. And so they are presented as the innocent. And then, but the assumption is that the sex worker, that they were the guilty ones and that they deserve to be punished. And I realize that this is a problem even in the way in which I am problematizing the question of God's punishment. When you say, what about the innocents? And your thought immediately goes to the children. And then your assumption is that all the others who were destroyed were all guilty in exactly the same way that they deserved a similar kind of punishment from God. But throughout the narratives of punishment in the Quran, although there is this problem of collateral damage that I say, it is quite clear that the depictions, especially in the early Meccan surah, God aligns himself with those who are poor, vulnerable, or oppressed. Surah 89, we see this. In Surah 105, that we see that God punished those who endeavored to harm an early a vulnerable minority in Meccan society. The Quran identifies the sin most characteristically as insolence, haughtiness, and presumptuousness. Ingratitude, kufr, and arrogance of those who deny their dependence on God. And often the Quran relates this to materialistic greed. And it is precisely this sort of attitude that merits divine interventions. And so selective acts of punishment indicate God's choice to take the side of those who are weak or downtrodden, the ones who have pretensions of self-sufficiency. In Surah Abasa, we see God reprimanding Muhammad himself for failing to follow in God's way to embrace those in need, where a blind person, Abasa wa tawalla an ja'ahu al-a'ma wa ma yudrika la'allahu yazakka. A blind person comes to Muhammad while Muhammad is talking to a more influential and a more powerful person. Muhammad ignores the blind person and carries on talking to this more powerful person. And he is reprimanded for this by God in the Quran. Yeah. In summary, three essential characteristics of God. All-powerful deity who rules over all the universe, yet is also intimately involved in the most intimate moments of the life of a human being. He is depicted as being willing to punish those who disobey the moral law, and the stories of punishment are intended as warnings in order that the hearers may reform their attitudes and practices in submission to God. Third, God's actions and words in the early revelation indicate that God is explicitly committed to caring for the vulnerable and the oppressed. The characteristics of God, considered independently, do not necessarily entail a clear set of moral obligations, yet they are essential for grasping the pervasive concern for matters of socio-economic justice in the early Meccan surahs. And so there's an accounting that's going to be happened. And the Quran depicts this in, certainly the Meccan surahs account this in a very, very vivid way that I won't go into now. But the visions of the last day emphasize that God will be the sole judge of human actions and righteousness, and that each human is individually accountable for his or her soul. And this individual accountability flies in the face of collective responsibility that was characteristic of tribal society. And so in some ways the Quran comes with certainly for its time, with a new idea that وَأَلَّيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى, that human beings will have nothing except that what it strives for. But more poignantly, on the Day of Judgment, depicting the idea that your tribal bonds, your ethnicity, your racial affinity will be of no consequence. يَوْمَ يَفِرُّ الْمَرْءُ مِنْ أَخِيهِ وَأُمِّهِ وَأَبِيهِ وَصَاحِبَتِهِ وَبَنِيهِ. On the day when the father will flee from his son, the person from his brother, from his mother, and you will be entirely on your own. And so, now, the relationship of faith and charity in the Meccan surahs. The early Meccan surahs emphasize the divine call to Islam, to submission, and God's willingness to inflict punishment, as they're saying, but they are also replete with instructions regarding matters of personal wealth, financial generosity, and comprehensive charity. There is an intrinsic link between the idea of orthodoxy and orthopraxis in the Quran, and the idea that orthodoxy counts for nothing if it is not accompanied by orthopraxis. In fact, in the one text of the Quran, orthodoxy is denounced without orthopractice. أَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِي يُكَذِّبُ بِالدِّينِ. Have you seen the one who rejects deen, who rejects faith? And the one who rejects faith is not seen as the one who's got the correct dogma. فَذَلِكَ الَّذِي يَدُعُّ الْيَتِيمِ. He is the one who repulses the orphans. وَلَا يَحُدُّ عَلَى طَعَامِ الْمِسْكِينِ. And denies the use of ordinary things to the poor. فَوَيْلٌ لِلْمُصَلِّينَ. Woe! Cursed are the ones who pray. الَّذِينَ هُمْ يُرَاءُونَ. Who desire to be seen. And at the same time, يَمْنَعُونَ الْمَاعُونَ. They prevent others from access to the ordinary daily requirements of life. And so a simple reading of the early Meccan surahs reveal that the condemnation of hoarding and exhortation to generosity pervades the text.
It's time enough.
You should never tell a preacher this. So there's this constant stress on moral righteousness, righteous conduct, and prudent conduct. But this translates into ethical commands regarding individual wealth and consideration for the poor and the vulnerable. When the Quran in these early texts speak of what is right and what is wrong, it either directly or indirectly refers to matters of economics and charity. For example, in Surah Al-Humazah, where, I'm not showing off, but generally Muslim theologians, when we when we deal with the Quran, we first get the stuff in Arabic before we get the stuff in English. And I realize it's kind of, well, useless for most of you, but it still may give you an idea that I know what I'm talking about. These Germans get fooled easily. I'm joking. وَيْلٌ لِكُلِّ هُمَزَةٍ لُمَزَةٍ الَّذِي جَمَعَ مَالَهُ وَعَدَّدَ. Woe unto him who amasses wealth, and he counts it as a safeguard, thinking that his wealth will make him live forever. يَحْسَبُ أَنَّ مَالَهُ أَخْلَدَ. He thinks that his wealth will make him live forever. And so this idea of thinking of security as not sufficiency, but security as owning big time. This whole idea of growth being connected to how wealthy you are in relation to poverty is denounced in the Quran, particularly the idea of amassing wealth simply because your own your emptinesses can now only be filled by goods. So these lines are clearly aimed at the tendency towards arrogance and self-importance that the Quran identifies in human. They demonstrate how the divine denunciation of such an attitude takes the form of a criticism of an economic practice. In the early revelations, the fruits of human arrogance take the form in the economic realm. Surah An-Shiqaq ends with the following warning: hence, give them the tiding of grievous suffering in the life to come, unless it be such of them as repent and attain to faith and do good works, for theirs shall be a reward unending. In Surah Mutaffifin, the Quran directly relates denial of faith to the immoral social conducts. Cursed are those who call it a lie, who deny the day of reckoning. Who would deny it but the oppressor, hard in wrong? In this example, the text suggests that the arrogance of those who refuse to submit to God is identical with the arrogance of one who intentionally imposes and benefits from unjust social and economic arrangement. In Surah Balad, أَلَمْ نَجْعَلْ لَهُ عَيْنَيْنِ وَلِسَانًا وَشَفَتَيْنِ وَهَدَيْنَاهُ النَّجْدَيْنِ فَلَقَتَحَمَ الْعَقَبَةَ وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةُ. أَلَمْ نَجْعَلْ لَهُ عَيْنَيْنِ. Have we not? أَلَمْ نَجْعَلْ لَهُ عَيْنَيْنِ وَلِسَانًا وَشَفَتَيْنِ وَهَدَيْنَاهُ النَّجْدَيْنِ. And have shown him two paths. فَلَقَتَحَمَ الْعَقَبَةَ وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةُ. But few are those who ascend the difficult path. And what will convey unto you what the difficult path is? فَكُّ رَقَبَةٍ. The first is فَكُّ رَقَبَةٍ, to free one's neck, to bring an end to slavery. فَكُّ رَقَبَةٍ أَوْ إِطْعَامٌ فِي يَوْمٍ ذِي مَزْغَبَةٍ أو إطعام في يوم ذي مسغبة أو يتيما ذا مقربة. Feeding upon a day of hunger, of an orphan near of kin, or a needy stranger lying in the dust. فك رقبة أو إطعام في يوم ذي مسغبة أو مسكينا ذا متربة ثم كان من الذين آمنوا. Then only do you become among those who believe. And so the explicitness of connecting your social conduct, your relationship with people, your engagement in struggles to alleviate poverty, there is an intrinsic connection between all of this and the faith of the believer. I've pointed out earlier to you the verse wherein God actually curses those who pray but who do not understand, who are mindless of the consequences of their prayers. So the early Meccan surahs also introduced the notions that acts of charity may be undertaken in an effort of purification. I mean, the word zakah, for example, it means to purify, but it also means to prune. The whole idea that wealth may actually pervert, and that your dispensing of your wealth is a pruning. But a pruning also implies hurt. A pruning also implies hurt, but a pruning of a plant also implies growth. Not financial growth necessarily, as Muslims often say, you know, or the biblical this things about if you give this manifold, what is this, the corn, you know, 70-fold. Who are the biblical scholars here? You know, when it will be multiplied 70-fold for you. Also, I mean, we often think, you know, if you give like, you know, 10 euros, you know, God is going to give me 100 euros more. This kind of thing, as if God is some kind of con guy on the street who promises you all these things. And so the notion of giving as connected to your own growth and your own purification. And so there is this overwhelming concern with socioeconomic dispositions of the people of God. Okay? But is it only charity that we are busy with? You know, I often tell, she was a very, very kind lady. I think she comes from a neighboring country, a great hero of this neighboring country. But I often tell the story of, especially in relation to HIV. I tell the story of a woman who walks past a mountain stream one day, and then she sees a baby coming down the mountain stream. And then rushes, you know, to take care of the baby and so on, and then looks up. And then after 2-3 days, she comes and she finds another baby. And she looks after the baby and cares for the baby. And another baby and another baby. And after a while, she starts going in search of babies that have been abandoned. Sets up an orphanage or a caring place for babies at the bottom of the mountain, because at this particular mountain, a lot of babies are coming down the river all the time, half injured, half dead, and so on. Could even start an international religious order where we particularly look after babies that have been thrown away and so on. But never asks who throws these babies down the river. Who is responsible for this? And it may be hard to pause for a moment, because you could lose a baby in the process, and go up on the side and find out who is there on top. To go to the top is a political act. You're going to find somebody there who is responsible for this. But that is politics. To analyze the systemic roots of socio-economic injustice in our society. You may possibly confront a family member of yours at the top of the mountain who has also been funding you for your orphanage at the same time. I mean, this is what is really happening in the world today. We create the conditions for unemployment, we create the conditions for poverty, and then we also run aid projects. I mean, okay, I don't want to go, I often draw far too many analogies from my work in the AIDS field. But it's you look, for example, at patent rights in relation to antiretrovirals. And we are tied into international agreements to only buy ARVs from particular companies, okay, who has these patent rights. And it's hugely expensive for third world countries. And then many countries in the West then provide aid for AIDS work, for HIV work. They provide aid to us to buy the medicines. But we are also contracted to buy the medicines from those companies inside their own countries. And so their aid budgets look good, We're not allowed in the two-third world to develop our own because they have the patent rights over it. And so we're also tied into economic relations, but it's a win-win situation. I throw the babies down the river, and I look very good as the funder of this hospital. And so, people, my voice is this thing, and that's in part because I just arrived in the morning, but it's good news for you, which means I will wrap up shortly. And so, the Meccan surahs exhort the believers to establish social practices, how they are to work for communal expressions of generosity, and how this message called for socio-economic justice in the context of pre-Islamic Arabia. The most explicit example of this is found in Surah At-Takwir, in which a typical apocalyptic vision includes the following one. وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. And when the girl child that was buried alive is made to ask for what crime she had been slain. And so here we see this, it was the customary practice of burying girl children. Sadly, it hasn't ended in many parts of the world. And so God will interrogate the oppressed. God will interrogate those who had been harmed and hold those who have been responsible for this accountable. So we see that the Quran doesn't merely assert that the girl child will be saved from her fate, but that she will be allowed to speak and to confront her murderers, demanding an explanation. So these early revelations set out a moral obligation that is revolutionary for its social orientation. Hearers of the Quran are expected to carry out works of compassion and to ensure that others do the same. So I don't think we can underestimate the force of these early Meccan surahs in establishing a new paradigm for understanding of the relation between self and society. Okay, let me just make a few concluding remarks. One of the difficulties that we have is in our coexistence, we are never asked, what do you bring to our societies? The question is always, how can you be accommodated in our societies with the least convenience to us? I put it to you, friends, that the Quranic paradigm, particularly reflected in the early Meccan surahs, makes something very, very clear, that we share with co-religionists from every faith. And this is that not a single prophet of God ever came into this world and asked, how do I fit in with dominant society? How do I fit in with the dominant paradigm? German society may make this the big question that it asks of Muslims. Muslim society may make this the dominant question that it asks of other minorities in their own society. But this is a profoundly heretical question. Not a single prophet of God came into this world and asked, how do I fit in with dominant society? And so this huge obligation that there is on Muslims to fit in with Western society, it is hugely problematic. Muslims must ask, how do we challenge the societies wherein we find ourselves? But by Muslim, I don't mean somebody just wearing a Muslim tag. And so it isn't just a question of how do I as a Turk, how do I as a Moroccan, but how do I as a Muslim, somebody struggling to submit to the will of God, how do I challenge the dominant society. And not how do I challenge the dominant society simply because I want to affirm my own rights. But how do I challenge the dominant society about how it treats my marginalized group, but other marginalized group in our societies? And you know best who the marginalized groups in your societies are. I mean, in England, for example, now, the East Europeans, the earlier East Europeans, are now becoming the others. The Poles and the Czechs and so on, they are now becoming the despised other. Muslims are very, very good at playing the victim game, okay? We don't need any further encouragement to play the victim game. So it's not the victim game that I'm appealing to. I am saying that there is a prophetic compulsion in the Quran to identify with the marginalized and to seek out to be with the marginalized. The Quranic compulsion isn't to want to fit in with power. And in this, the challenge is, how do we forge alliances with other sectors of the society in doing so? How do we forge alliances with sectors in the religious communities, in the non-religious communities who don't share our dogma? Because dogma is not the big thing. It is also praxis. It is how do we live. And this is, I think, the challenge. I know that there's I'm talking theologically. I do understand that there are socio-political contexts to all of this. It's easy for me. I come from a society where Muslims have lived for 360 years, where there's a musalla, a place to pray in parliament. There's a place to take wudu in parliament, where several of our ministers wear hijab. Where the Speaker of our upper house wears hijab. It's just unimaginable that anybody will give you a second look at your scarf. You know, it's just unthinkable that anybody would. Nobody asks any questions about. Oh, you've got so many ministers. Our country's first Chief Justice was a religious Muslim. Or somebody with a big beard in cabinet and his jubba and so on. Nobody. So I come from such a country. We've been there for 350 years. We don't have any anxieties about, how do I get a permission for my father who's still in Morocco, or I still need a permit for my mother who's still in Turkey that I'm trying to bring to Germany. We don't have any of those issues, okay? So I come from a very, very different kind of country. And I can understand that there are many, many identity issues that people in Germany have. And sociologically, these are processes that often unfold on their own. But religious communities, regardless of their sociological identities, remain people that strive towards something beyond sociological and political compulsions, that there is a theological compulsion. And for me, the huge theological compulsion in our age is that we are accountable to God to speak the truth to justice, walau ala anfusikum, though this may be against yourself. Thank you very much.
Adam Vons Catholic University of Lublin in Poland, because you mentioned my brothers and sisters in Britain, so let me just say a word, not just to divide them. But there are 2 points. Well, first of all, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I mean, it's maybe things that everybody feels like that. The first question, or my first remark, going back to that what you have said about the consequences and going back to the roots about religion or religious people. I am a priest, a Catholic priest. I am a religious man as from the Society of Divine Word. So I feel like somebody who is helping people going, well, to the consequences in which the poor people are living. And then I'm trying to find also ways to resolve the problems. I would say the Mother Teresa of Calcutta was doing all the same. But there was such a strong critic why she did it, why she didn't try to resolve the problem. And then we are coming to a wall. You put it into your topic. Because if you try to resolve the problems as a religious man, as a religion, or of people of faith, they would say, stop. That's a question of politics. And you are living in a secular state. We listened to that at the very beginning. And there is the point about the secular and secularists, as we were learning. But I still would say there is a big problem when you, as a religious man, I mean a believing man, not just a religious, but believing man, try to resolve questions of their poverty, then you would say, no, stop. That's the question of politics. And you are not allowed to get into it because that is not your space. That was the first question. And the second, going back to your presentation, which I was over, you brought so many quotations from the Holy Quran, which are not, of course, over there. But I would be much more interested in having just a few of them, but put into the context. Because I know you can actually bring the quotations from the Holy Quran for everything you would like to put arguments. But you mentioned also how important it is to put the message into the context. So that was I would like to get it more of it. I know the time has run out. That's the problem. But I mean, the context is always for me important, and unfortunately I did not learn it from that what you said, even though it was so interesting. Thank you very much.
Can I respond immediately?
Yes,
Else I will. Thank you very much. I think that first of all, I mean, there is the question of living religiously in a so-called secular society. I don't accept this religious secular binaries. I think that the idea of any society being purely secular or purely religious, I think these are mythical constructs. I mean, you guys know better than this, but the example, for example, the idea that Germans, if they don't want to contribute their church tax, they must tick off a box to say no, they will not. But the assumption is that they will. Or the idea that the Queen is the head of the Anglican Church. So there are various levels, or you could take it to, say, the extent that the United States has taken it, and then at the same time on all the money notes you have "In God We Trust." So there is this idea, that secularism is just one huge thing, and then religious communities are just. So that is the first thing that I would want to take issue with. The second thing is, I think it is in political action does not necessarily mean party political action. It's quite, I mean, the famous things of Dom Helder Camara, when he said that when I go to assist the poor, they call me a Christian. And when I ask why people are poor and challenge the reasons behind poverty, then they call me a communist. So this, I think, is the dilemma of religious believers who insist on going beyond their religious labels, but want to remain true to the prophetic natures in the religion. Now, I know sometimes religions can become just social institutions. And so it is this Muslim community in relation to a Christian community and a Baha'i community, and it's like the CDU. Whether there's anything really Christian about it or not, that's debatable. okay? Or people wear the crucifix as a little cultural thing. This is what Christians are supposed to wear. I'm not talking about religious communities in that sense. I'm talking about religious quite in the literal sense, you know, people with a responsibility to something beyond themselves. So I think there will always be tensions between religious beings and those who seek to reduce religion entirely to the private domain. So that's in response to your first question. In response to your second question, I think you have a point. I will consider the point when I write my paper up. But I really want to emphasize that if you look at the shorter Meccan surahs, all the shorter Meccan surahs, and it's not just a question of kind of picking a verse from here and picking a verse from there. It wasn't just cherry picking. The entire things of the shorter Meccan surahs carry this the responsibility, accountability to God, having to answer God, and relating this to the power structures in Mecca, to how kufr and the rejection of God and the rejection of God's prophet, how it was related to their political power that they were defending. I mean, okay, I wanted to make a completely side comment, but that would have detracted from my response to your question.
So in between there are 5 questions. I take up the first 3 of you. So 2 on the table over there. The woman with the glasses, I don't know her name, I'm sorry, and...
Yeah, Sigrid Rettenbacher from Salzburg. You mentioned that religious people should challenge the society they live in. I suppose this is not only true for Muslim believers, but for Christian as well. But the problem that arises is that religious communities are pluralistic within. So I suppose you would challenge, as a Muslim theologian, a society in a different way from a Muslim who sympathizes with ISIS, for example, or me as a Catholic liberal theologian would challenge a society differently from an evangelical Christian, for example. So the question is, who has the power to define in which way to challenge society? Or what could be criteria if we challenge society in the right way?
Can we collect questions first of all, because there's so many. So, yeah.
Michaela Neulinger, University of Innsbruck. Thank you very much, first of all, for your very inspiring lecture, which is going to be very useful for my own work as well. And you mentioned the problems with liberalism, that liberals are putting under pressure religions, especially Islam. And now my question is the liberal paradigm necessarily unable to deal with religion? Is it necessarily ignoring religion? And has liberalism come to an end now, facing the rise of religions in public? And in case you say yes, the the liberal paradigm has come to an end, facing religion, being unable to deal with religious arguments, what would a different, I'm hesitating to say paradigm again, or ideology again, how would a different vision look like?
One more, please. Over here. Chris Hewer.
Yes, Chris Hewer from England. Farid, you mention often this linking of the social and the vertical in the early surahs. So if we take the pairing, establish the prayers and pay the zakat, which is linked many times, the whole crucial point about the zakat here is it's not a free will pay. It's not charity. That those in need have a right to demand from those who have to excess. And if we go from that point, it is now some 30 years since the report of Willy Brandt, which for my generation made a huge impact, to say that the south of the world are impoverished because of the excess consumption of the north of the world. 30 years later, we realize that those who have do not freely give up what they have. So if we are warners in society, as religious people, as Christians and Muslims, what is then our duty in terms of establishing social justice and thinking of the great social disadvantage that we see between North and South in the world, for example, and in our own communities?
Who defines and who challenges? Who says that we are more authentic than, say, ISIS, that is also rebelling against a world order? It's a difficult question. And this is in part related to the question also that came after yours. I don't have an answer for your question. In my book, Quran, Liberation and Pluralism, I try to outline a number of hermeneutical keys and suggest that the Quran must be examined through these lenses, and that these lenses will enable those of us who are committed to a more just society to arrive at a more authentic understanding of the Quran. So, a more authentic understanding of the Quran. I don't hold on to the idea that there is an authentic understanding of the Quran. This is the final word. I approach the texts with my limitations and my human baggage, and with certain criteria that I have found helpful theologically and morally, and that I have defended textually. But I can only arrive at a more approximate. And so there is an element of jurism, of tentativeness, of trial and error. And therefore I'm not an ideologue who come with, this is my thing that I want to sell. I'm passionate about the things that I believe in. I'm passionate about my commitment and so on to the poor. But I'm also happy to recognize that, okay, tomorrow, this is my understanding of the marginalized today. Tomorrow, I may be arriving at a different point. Human beings may develop an ethical consciousness in the years to come about other sentient beings in the world. That in the same way that women, for example, for many centuries, weren't regarded as having a soul. And then we discovered that women do have souls, and women are equal to men. We may discover that our other inhabitants of the earth also feel and also sense and also have rights that we haven't imagined now. We now think of animal rights in a particular way. As human beings develop, and then we would be confronted again with new theological challenges. So it's very difficult to define what is the real McCoy. And so along with selling a couple of principles and an ongoing struggle to figure out where the margins are. I mean, in South Africa, for example, in my own things, I really worked this in the struggle against apartheid. And then when the new South Africa was born, I realized, nothing has changed for women. And so I kind of shifted my work into gender activism. And then this huge pandemic hit our country, HIV and AIDS, and the stigmatization of people living with AIDS. That about 48% of all our parliamentarians are women in South Africa. In South Africa, I mean, it is just unimaginable anywhere to find just a bunch of men. It is embarrassing to have a panel of speakers and no women. Oh, people will cringe, you know, at this kind of thing. So legally, women have arrived, and there's a strong gender activist movement in the country. And then, but I saw this HIV thing. This was now about 20 or 12, about 15 years ago. And the stigmatization that accompanies people that are living with HIV. And so I found a new parameter of what my commitment to. So what I'm trying to say is it's very difficult to define this. And this we do in, you know, in the old-fashioned liberation theology, kind of reflection and action, and you go back to praxis and discover new questions and so on. This also leads me then to the other question about the problem with the liberal paradigm and what is an alternative paradigm. I'm lost. I'm lost. I know that the obsession of the liberal paradigm with the individual, the whole idea that there is no society, of individual well-being, the refusal of liberalism to acknowledge systemic injustices, that this is deeply problematic, that this cannot but lead to the entrenchment of unjust economic systems, the idea that I am only responsible to myself, and I can make it, and regardless of what are the systematic, when I talk about systematic, I talk about the economic, socio-economic obstacles to others. I find this deeply problematic. And at the same time, I mean, I'm completely opposed to the imposition of beliefs onto societies. The idea that, that an orthodoxy can determine that this is how people must dress, that this is how people must choose their life partners. I think that there is, for me certainly, there is this whole idea, and it has a prophetic precedent about finding, you know, there is a hadith, a prophetic tradition which says that good is that which you have done, and people tell you that it's not on, but your heart is at ease with what you have done. And bad is that which people are trying to console you and tell you that is bad, but you are perfectly comfortable and therefore seek a fatwa from your heart. So there is this thing about your conscience and that's not really an answer. But I do want to say that in the way in which I approach things, I'm opposed to coming up with paradigms that will work in every society. I think all answers leads to fascism. That I have the answer, we have the answer, and this is a complete self-contained set of answers that we have the right to impose on society. Chris, you are right about the question of zakah. I mean, the Quran, I think you referred to this. وَفِي أَمْوَالِهِمْ حَقٌّ مَعْلُومٌ لِلسَّائِلِ وَالْمَحْرُومِ. And in their wealth, in the wealth of the rich, is the right of those who ask and those who are deprived. And so in some ways the Quran recognizes that wealth doesn't come from the air. Wealth comes from socio-economic processes and dealings, and that people can usurp systematically through coercion, through wars, through economic systems and so on, the wealth that also belongs to other people. What do we do in the face of this? We only have social activism. We only have social activism. Now you can then ask, okay, so you get into your Jubilee organizations, your fair trade organizations, you go into your advocacy for greater socio-economic justice, for greater equality. So what is this? You're kind of just shouting into the wind, you're just calling for more social activism. You're not coming along with concrete answers for a new society. I don't know if it is my responsibility or ours, I mean, I don't know how many other religious people there are in the audience, but I don't know if it is our responsibility to come up with alternative paradigms. I think it is our responsibility to work towards a more just society. But it is only our responsibility to work towards a more just society. Establishing a just society, creating it, we co-create it in small ways around us all the time as we challenge the bigger injustices around us and struggle to move closer towards it. There is a hadith, I think it comes in the front of On Being a Muslim, a book that is on sale here. You know, where the Prophet says, if you're on your way to your fields to go and plant your date seed, and the last hour strikes, go ahead and plant it. And I think it's a very important, these things for me, that you will not be asked about whether you achieved anything. You will only be asked religiously, you'll be held accountable for whether you acted within the parameters of your capacity. Not much of an answer to any of the three questions. I could easily ascribe it to fatigue, but the more honest answer is just this guy hasn't thought enough about the kind of things that he speaks about.
So there are 4 more comments, 2 here on the front table. Perhaps you could put the microphone to the colleague sitting next to Tobias Becker. And he's at the second one, and then over there. Perhaps only 2 first of all, and then the other 2, and then let's see whether there's enough time for even more, but I don't think so.
Okay, thank you very much for this inspiring lecture. My question is related to the function of religions in nowadays, in our current societies. When you mentioned this example with the babies coming down from the mountain, and you were about to go ahead and challenging the whole system, but you said it's enough, I wouldn't like to go ahead. I guess that your assumption is that religion nowadays has the function of just minimizing the suffering of societies, doing work, and are responsible for problems that they were not those who did the mistake. Those children coming downstairs, or those people who we are doing healthcare and chaplaincy for them, their problem are not coming from religious institutions or from religion. What I guess is that you are thinking of the role of religion is not, in a Marxist way, let me put it in this way, it's not to describe and to describe the system, but to challenge it, to change it. But you didn't go ahead. Do you think that religion nowadays can change the system? And we have the system of the example of ISIS. These organizations who think that they speak on the name of religion, they challenge the whole system and want to tell people how to live with religion. So do you think that it's possible to challenge the whole system, and is it possible, and how to do that, if it's possible?
Okay.
Write your neighbor for the next question, yes.
Thank you. I'm just continuing. I didn't know what you were telling. Just one question more about the challenging, how to challenge. So I remember there was a big advertising of the one German newspaper from the Rainbow Press with big letters and big pictures, so the Bild, and they asked their critics to say a critical sentence about them. And then they made the advertising with a critical sentence. So they completely overtook the way of criticizing. And when I look, maybe you Muslims are better in this, but when I look on the church, that's exactly what happens. So the society is expecting the church of criticizing. They say something nice, criticizing about the society, financial capitalism, that they are not looking after the poor. And everyone is saying, yes, that's very important. And nothing is changing, nothing is happening. It's part, so critic is part of the system. How can you avoid being this?
Okay. Okay. First of all, I didn't want to suggest, perhaps I did suggest, okay, but you're giving me a time to backtrack and to rethink what I said. When, for example, I spoke about the huge amount of church support that there is for people living with HIV, but the church not doing anything to challenge the socio-economic conditions that make the poor more vulnerable to disease and that doesn't give the poor access to health services. When, for example, a wealthy person becomes HIV positive, I mean, really, it is just a bit of a headache for you to take your ARVs 2 or 3 times a day. It is just an inconvenience. But you will live now for as long as what an ordinary person of your age will live, 70 or 80 or 90 years old. And if you are a poor person, you will probably die in about 5 or 6 years if you don't have access to ARVs. So that systematic thing we understand. But I think in my criticism then of the role of religious organizations in response to the HIV pandemic, I may have given the impression that in the assistentialism, that they just want to assist. In liberation theology, of course, there has been a critique of this assistentialism. But I don't think that I've ever that I want to suggest that there is no role for assistentialism. I think that when a baby comes down the mountain, that there is still a need for caring. There is still value in somebody going and picking the baby up and nurturing the baby. My problem is when that is seen as religious. But when the act of going up and confronting the person doing it, when that is not seen as religious. And so I want to religionize the act of confrontation. I want to religionize it in the same way that the act of caring is religionized and is acceptable in our church structures. So it's in some ways a foregrounding, or why isn't liberation theology or as important as a theology of caring? So I simply wanted to do that, and I may have kind of over-critiqued the idea of compassion and caring and so on. And so, but are we the only ones who challenge? Systems are being challenged. ISIS also challenges. I understand that ISIS also challenges, and that ISIS challenges in a really serious way. But 2 things. The one is that they only challenge in a more dramatic way. They don't really challenge in a serious way. I mean, look, guys, nothing that ISIS is doing is not being done on a fairly regular basis by the Saudis. The Saudis cut off
heads, they cut off hands, they do it all in public. They go around with loudspeakers, inviting people to come and watch it. They just don't allow you to video it anymore. The Saudis have for decades now been destroying the archaeological heritage of all Muslims, and nobody cares a hoot. Women aren't allowed to drive cars, forget about driving their own lives. But the Saudis do it in style. They do it in style. They're not kind of scruffy barbarians. They're not dressed properly. No, the thing, it fits very nicely in a nice gold-rimmed, this thing's in a nice garb, and it's a king. And so we look at ISIS as these things. The Saudis have been leading for, and I maybe have taken issues with some of my fellow brothers and sisters in faith here, but the Saudis have been leading this movement systematically through money. ISIS just uses crude violence and a much more exciting kind. But the Saudis have been buying off Muslims to precisely this kind of ideology for many, many years. And so we also need to look at how do we view these things. What makes us kind of get particularly worked up about the one thing, but not worked up about the other. I haven't been to Mecca in about 25 years, despite the fact that I can afford to go. I don't want to be confronted with the pain of what they have done to the sacred spaces. I will not be able to deal with the pain of building a Big Ben tower that really completely overshadows the Kaaba, and I can't deal with it. I prefer to live with my fading memories of what it was 25, 30 years ago. That doesn't answer your question. My problem is that the value lies in challenging, but a challenge that is continually accompanied by a self-critique. You challenge Taghut, what is Taghut? That's Tawheed, the opposite of Taghut. Muna, Taghut. ويكفر بالطاغوت يؤمن بالله ويكفر بالطاغوت. Taghut, tyranny, okay. The one is that you resent and you reject tyranny. But you continuously also look at your own tyrannical tendencies. That is what I meant when I said you go up the mountain and you find a mirror of yourself up there in the mountain. So here you are charitable down at the bottom of the mountain. You go up and you find other parts of yourselves engaging in this. You know how you can be. I often use, and I'm slightly off the point, but I'll come back to it. I often use the analogy of a black worker during the day who confronts his boss, his white boss, who exploits him and humiliates him. But he internalizes his humiliation, goes home at night, repeats the same pattern of behavior in relation to his wife. And so during the day, I'm compelled to be in solidarity with this man. But at night, I'm compelled to be in solidarity with his wife. Now, don't take this analogy too far, okay, about being in solidarity with his wife at night. I only mean in supporting his wife as somebody that is being abused. And so the problem is that ISIS, on the one hand, sets itself up as the liberator of people, but through the very way it goes about things and in the order that it establishes, become even worse replications of that which they had set about to destroy. And so it's easy, I mean, I often think that the problem with what we describe with Muslim fundamentalists is that their big issue isn't the fact that there is oppression and so on in the world. It is the fact that they're not the ones doing the oppressing. This is, I think, their big beef with the world. Is there an alternative? I think paradigms I avoid. Alternatives are movements, self-reflective movements, and so on. I didn't deal with your questions, but I can't make out my own handwriting, and I don't have my glasses with me. He's much more older than what he looks.
Well, you answered it part by part, so.
Thank you for your generosity.
That's how it is. So there are two more comments, and I ask you for brief comments, please. So you first, please. And you may introduce yourself also.
Might be just a very quick one. Dietrich Werner speaking for Church Development, Protestant Church Development Services, Bread for the World, Berlin, formerly WCC in Geneva. It was very inspiring and enriching to listen to your rereading of early Quranic traditions, and the impression which rests with me is that we do share between Christian tradition and or Hebrew tradition and Muslim traditions quite a lot in terms of a deep understanding of God's preferential option for the poor, of God's passion for justice, which is more than just safeguarding my own rights, and of the possibility to transform this world in the perspective of God's justice. Now the question which comes up very strongly, why is it that both Christian majority countries and Muslim majority countries do not yet seem to be the avant-garde to press for a justice agenda in terms of the globalization processes in this world? Why is it, do we have so much misreading or short-sighted readings of both Muslim traditions and Christian biblical traditions? The social prophetical tradition in Old Testament is so close to some of what you have spelled out of early Quranic tradition that it is really striking. And you know that in this year we are in a quite crucial
we are running out of time, so
period. Just to close this sentence,
I think your question has become clear.
In developing a new world agenda for development, which is the Sustainable Development Goals, which you know will be. Why is it that Muslim countries and Christian countries are not the forerunners and the pressure group to get this new agenda done? Something is wrong.
Thank you. And a last question in the very corner.
I'm Martin Kirschner from Tübingen. I teach Catholic dogmatics there. And just a very brief comment. Thank you very much. I think that you gave a very important and challenging point for Muslims as well as Christians. And you said that it's time to stop to play a victim game, to stop to play an identity game, and even to play a neutralization game of secularism. Yeah? But instead to turn to the other, to the oppressed, because only so we can turn to God, yeah? And to be prophetic. I just have the feeling that these points are very close between Christians, Jews, and Muslims, but they depend strongly on the epistemology, how to read the own tradition. And that's a philosophical question. So how is the relationship between the religious question and the philosophical question? That would be my point.
Okay, I'll respond very briefly. I think that we have to reconcile ourselves to the fact that the prophetic tendencies in religion will always be minority tendencies. This is the nature of being prophetic. That prophetic tendencies will never become mainstream. Now, I'm not saying that you must rejoice in being on the margins. I'm not saying that you must aspire to be on the margins. There's a continuous ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikma wa maw'idatan lil hasana wajadilhum billati huwa ahsan. Billati huwa ahsan. But I knew there was something wrong. Wajadilhum billati hiya ahsan. And so there is a strategic element in how you go about calling people to your truths. But we have to embrace the fact that prophetic appreciations of the faith will always be on the margins. Indeed, once a religion occupies the center, then it inevitably becomes sociological, it becomes ideological, and so in relation to larger society, if you embrace the prophetic task, be strategic, continue to struggle to, I'm not saying just go and scream into the wind, that may have its value also. And this explains why quote-unquote Muslim societies or quote-unquote Christian societies simply do not do the right thing. Because these are not prophetic communities. These are political entities, these are ideological entities, they are state entities. Why often Muslims who live outside these minority states are in a better position to speak the truth to power than those who are inside the country. It is a question of going beyond tradition, but only a question of going beyond tradition as it has fossilized and presents itself as this closed corpus, this closed community. But we also know that dissent is as much a part of our traditions as what the normative part of our traditions are. So the church, for example, wants to say, that the church only consists of these hierarchies. But we also know that there have always been your lunatics inside the church. There's always been your saints inside the church, your mad people who continue to speak the truth to power. Inside the Islamic traditions, you've continuously, and these speakers of truth to justice inside our traditions, they also a part of tradition. So I'm saying it is simultaneously a question of challenging how we define tradition, and at the same time refusing to leave this huge body that is called the church or called the ummah, refusing to leave it because we also say that no, this is my heritage, especially the liberative elements in it. It is as much my heritage as what it was the heritage of, say, the Prophet or Abu Dhar or Hussein or Bacha Khan in the northwest frontier province of India, as it is that of the more famous claimants to the tradition. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your inspiring ideas, for all the examples you gave us, and I'm sure that there are many, many questions we will have to reconsider during the conference in the next days, and I'm glad that you're joining us then. And yes, I think we will have to think a lot about what is our role, our responsibility within the struggle against injustice as a community, as individuals, or also as communities that try to work together. But first of all, for today, thank you to Farid Ezak. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, everybody. I really appreciate your response to my talk. Thank you very, very much, and God bless you all.
God bless you.